In the mid-1930s, the British Army, which was always fairly forward-thinking in terms of AFV design, although not necessarily so in practice, mainly due to financial constraints, decided to re-evaluate their tank categorizations. The idea of having a heavy tank to work with the infantry and blow through the lines, and a light tank to go marauding, dates back at least as far as the Mark IVs and Whippets of World War I. However, the development was such that the Army's light tanks were becoming lighter and smaller, and the ability for them to do any significant marauding was starting to drop. Plus, you had the additional problem that you were more and more likely to find something that was going to shoot back. So they moved on to infantry tanks and cruiser tanks. The infantry would, well, work with the infantry tanks, and the cruisers would be the ones doing the exploitation. The task for designing the cruiser tank fell to Vickers and their genius designer John Carden in 1934. The mission given to him was to come up with something cheaper than the A7E3 or the A8 then under consideration. What he came up with was the A9, which entered service as a cruiser tank Mark I. Welcome to the Tank Museum Bovington, and the start of the story of the A9's brother, the A10. The A9, by most standards, was a modern tank. You have the driver up front, you have a powered three-man turret, you got the drivetrain at the back with the sprockets. There were a couple of problems, though, which prevented it from being the world-leading tank at the beginning of World War II. Firstly, it was riveted. Secondly, you have these anachronistic machine gun turrets, which lead to all sorts of design problems afterwards. Most importantly, though, the thing only has a half-inch of armour, and it was becoming very obvious that this was no longer going to cut it. The Armour Corps decided that, well, okay, the A9 may have been good enough for the tank brigades, but for the Army tank battalions, you still needed something a little bit heavier. So they put the word back down, give us something that has an inch of armour. Carden, reasonably enough, simply took their new A9 design and added armour to it. This brings us now to the A10, which, as you can see, has a strong family resemblance. By ditching the twin machine gun turrets at the top, this reduced the amount of volume that had to be protected by armour, and it also allowed the tank to be a tad shorter. As a result, A10, with about twice the effective armour thickness of its sibling, ended up being a little under 2 tons heavier. Initially, it had a very nice sloped front with a little housing for the driver. However, somebody at the War Office decided it might actually be a good idea to have a bow machine gun. As a result, the driver was shifted off to the side, interestingly to the left, and the machine gun position added to the right. And the box superstructure was added to cover everybody up. It's the price you pay for interior volume, although it destroyed the nicely sloped armour it used to have. There is still some sloping, mind, and I would note the horizontal ribbing, which has a couple of effects. Firstly, it actually does add a little bit to the effective armour value. Secondly, it stops ricochets from coming up into the driver's face. And thirdly, and most importantly, it stops people from slipping off the tank in wet weather. Construction is of a riveted and bolted type, as you can see, but there was a bit of a tweak with the A10. It was built with what was known as composite armour. And what you would do then is you'd start with the frame, you would rivet a softer steel skin to the frame, and then you would attach on top of that softer skin the actual armour plate. And what you have is a sort of a face-hardened defective equivalent, or if nothing else, the soft steel would be a spall liner. The idea was it would make it easier to repair and build. Now, the initial tanks did not come with the hull machine gun because at the time the coaxial in the turret was a Vickers 303. So now if you're trying to talk about mixing 303 and 792 in the same tank, you're just asking for trouble. As a result, the bow was simply blanked off. Now later on, production changed. The turret got the besa. This allowed the besa to be installed into the hull. And this brings us to the nomenclature issue, which in typical British period practice was absolutely horrible. All the A10s were cruiser Mark IIs. If you had the Vickers coaxial, you are a Mark I. If you had the Beza, you are a Mark 1A. But because this particular tank has a 3.7-inch mortar, people call it a howitzer, but it's actually a mortar, this is now the close support variant. So what we're looking at is Cruiser Mark II, A10, Mark 1A CS. Isn't that fun? Other items on the front, well, you're going to see the headlights, of course, are large, as was typical at the time. You've got your little hooks here for towing or lifting. And, well, that's pretty much it, although I do note the little marker lights on the corners. Track tension is incredibly basic on this vehicle. It is a ratchet and pawl. So if you wanted to loosen the track tension, you would have to release this little locking nut on the pole, lift it up, and then you would insert levers into the slots here and manually crank upwards or downwards as appropriate. Now, if you're tightening it, you don't even need to loosen the pole. Because of the shape of it, you simply tighten and it'll ratchet and lock into place. No specific level of tension is given in the manual. However, it does say that up to 2 inches of movement in the track return between the return rollers is acceptable. Coming around to the side of the tank brings us to the distinctive bogie suspension. Now the bogies are mounted 2 per side on the lower hull side. And as you can see, the lower hull side is actually angled a little bit, and this was a deliberate attempt to increase the armour protection. Although interestingly, the angling continues outwards as you go up into the upper superstructure, unlike the inwards of a lot of other vehicles. The suspension is officially known as the slow motion suspension, although it is also very often known as the Bright Idea, designed by Carden. It consists of a 24-inch front wheel, 2 19.5-inch rear wheels. Now the 19.5s are on a little independent bogie to the rear, the 24 inches on its own independent pivot point. The 24-inch is also identical to the idler wheel, so you have a little bit of exchange there as well. Now the advantage to having this rather obscure design is that you can have a large wheel for getting over obstacles, but the smaller rear wheels are A, lighter, and B, they take up less room, so you can have more wheels, more pressure points in a certain length of area. Now, of course, over time, this proved to be perhaps not the best compromise. The idea was dropped, but there you go. The tires are not actually molded onto the wheels. They're held in place by this bracket. The bracket is bolted on separately. The bracket also performs a wear plate function for the guide horns. The tracks, well, they're 73 links per side, and this is down 5 off of the 78 of the A9. They're cast of a malleable iron and are of a double pin type. Now the pins are lubricated, but not in the manner, say, you would find on a German half-track. They were lubricated once upon assembly. And then, when you put it together, rubber seals were supposed to keep the oil in and the dirt out. Note the use of the word supposed. The people who actually use it probably have their own ideas on the effectiveness of the system. As we move to the upper hull, I'm going to start at the front right corner with this ludicrously complicated arrangement of plates that all had to be fitted together. I count 12 of them, all within a 1 foot radius of this point here. Fire extinguisher located here. There is the builder's plate on the outside of the vehicle, which is a little bit unusual, and a wonderful amount of stowage for personal kit or the tank issue equipment. Finally, of course, we come to the air intake. The 14-tooth sprocket, which as you can see has a little bit of rubber on it as well, is driven by an AEC Type A179 engine. This is a 9.6 litre 6-cylinder, cranks out 150 horsepower at 2200 RPM. Now this is all mounted on a 4-point system as a single unit with the clutch and gearbox for easy maintenance. Now it's not what you would consider a power pack today though, because it does not include the steering or braking mechanisms. The engine is a dry sump system, uses 7 gallons of oil. The cooling system is 9 gallons of coolant, which is one more than that found on the A9, which is basically the same engine. The brakes, you will note, are on the outside of the vehicle, which is a little bit unusual. It has some advantages and 1 or 2 disadvantages. Advantages, well, firstly, they're on the outside of the tank, so you don't need to have room inside the armored hull. Space saver and weight saver. Secondly, it is very easy to repair these brakes. You simply pull off the housing, and there are your brake pads ready for replacement. Third advantage, cooling the brakes is really easy because you have all the air on the outside, and that's why these ribs are here, to add a little bit more surface area and to help it cool down faster. The really big disadvantage, though, is that the brakes are on the outside, and this means that they can be easily damaged. Now, the solution was to add an armored housing to the outside of the brakes to help protect against incoming fire or really large rocks or something which might damage the brakes, but as subsequent developments showed, it proved not to be the best idea of the lot, and after Valentine the idea was basically dropped. There are 2 fuel tanks in the rear hull by the engine, and they are both on the near side. Now, one will often hear near side and off side when talking about cars, but it's the first time I've ever read these descriptions in a tank manual before. Now, for those who don't understand, the near side is the side of the vehicle nearest to the curve. So in this case, because it is a British vehicle, that means the left-hand side of the tank. Each fuel tank is 33¼ gallons, bringing it up to a total of 66½, which is a little bit less than that found on the A9. However, there is a third fuel tank by the driver in A10, bringing the grand total up to 98. Now, filling up the fuel tanks of a British tank at the beginning of World War II would not have been so simple because one used what were known, reassuringly, as flimsies. These are 2-gallon or 4-gallon cans, which had a very nasty tendency of leaking a lot. Now, by the end of the war, the British had moved on to refueling together with the Americans with jerry cans, a design shamelessly stolen from the Jerrys, and quite arguably is the German military's greatest contribution to World War technology, and one which is very often overlooked in favor of bigger and flashier things. Anyway, that brings us to an end of the A10 exterior. Join us for part 2. We'll be back for the inside. Repairing the brakes is really easy because all you do is you just pull off the squeaky thing and come on through. It's a tad slow and underpowered, and there was something else wrong with it. Hope you found the tour of the A10 interesting and informative. And you're holding your face in your hands. You're obviously not having a good time with this, so something has screwed up somewhere.